Hello there, this is Rio. I run the humanities department here at Hamilton Education. I just wanted to welcome you all in to our test review videos for our Hamilton Education Test 305. I'll be walking us through the reading and writing section today, talking about every single question on the test, going through every single correct answer choice, and how we arrived to that correct answer choice. So thank you for joining me, and we'll get right into it with question one very shortly. Okay, so question one here of module one on test 305 is a word and context question that follows a very typical format that we see on the SAT, in that every single one of these every single one of these answer choices has the prefix re. Okay, so it can kind of become confusing or difficult to maneuver between all these answer choices, which kind of sound the same. But we just need to first figure out what kind of word we want here, and then which of these four words best suits what we want to put there. So what we want to say is something along the lines of discount, okay, or go away from, right? Because what is the theory or the logic of this passage? For a long time, everyone believed in the food pyramid, but now we want to do something else. So we're looking to go against what was earlier said, what the earlier recommendations. Reiterate means to repeat, right? Iterate meaning speak, and meaning to do again. To reiterate means to go deeper, prove something, or agree with something even more. So that doesn't work. Recompense, like compensate, means that we're giving money back. Okay, so someone can get recompensated or compensated for money that they provide for, let's say, a party or throwing a party, and you elect to buy the cake. Maybe you get some money back for that. So that's what recompense means. Repudiate is perfect here. Okay, what does repudiate mean? Repudiate means to go back or against something. So if someone makes the claim that, uh, mowing the lawn is the best thing you can do for your backyard, someone might repudiate that and say, well, mowing your lawn basically turns that piece of land into concrete, and give a whole bunch of examples as to why mowing the lawn is kind of a stupid, futile thing to do, right? So that would be to repudiate, to go against. That's exactly what we're looking for here, right? Finally, reprobate. That's not what you probably think it means. It doesn't have anything to do with probate. It's really someone who is kind of uh, kind of like a liar, or they go outside of what is typically expected by society. We'll put it like that. Okay, so it's someone who might, you know, show up to court wearing a hoodie and a pair of shorts, right? That would be kind of like being in that way. Usually it's sort of like in a way that's slightly charming, um, or something like that. So yeah, so that's what reprobate means, which doesn't work here either. So that's how we get to repudiate. If you're not getting this, you're going to have to study some roots, study some prefixes, and study vocab. Question two here on the first module is a great question. So let's talk about why it's a great question. First, we have a really good, really interesting passage, right? Talking about the Battle of Blair Mountain and the first rednecks, right? So the term redneck comes from referring to communist labor workers in Appalachia in West Virginia back in the early 1920s. Doesn't quite mean that same thing today, but that's where it comes from. That's what rednecks were. So we have, the reason why this is such a great question has to do with the fact that it does something the SAT does very commonly, which is it gives us words which show up in a form that we don't typically see them. All right. So agitating for change is what's correct here. And if you're watching this video, you likely know that that's the correct answer now, right? So why is that correct? Okay. Agitating sometimes means to annoy, right? I'm agitated right now. But agitate also means to shake up, right? If you were to take a water bottle and shake it up, that would be to agitate the water inside. You might know this from something like chemistry or chemistry labs that you run in any of your classes at school. Okay, so to agitate doesn't just mean to annoy, it doesn't just mean to bother, it can have, multiple meanings. And in this case, it means to shake things up for change. It is very, very commonly used in this specific format, all right, this specific setting. Cultivating, well, while you might cultivate change by creating change, by growing or making situations to help change, cultivating for change is something that we would never say, all right? Agitating for change is a common phrase. Cultivating for change isn't. If you're getting this question wrong, you likely didn't do our first week of vocab. This is in the first week of vocab for any students in tutoring, in any of our class offerings, anything like that. We have a question which is very, very similar to this with these specific words. Initiating for change doesn't make sense within this context. That would mean to be bringing people into a society or something like that for change. We don't see any like one joining a club. And then finally, insinuating. Insinuating for change, to insinuate something is to suggest something, usually kind of like with subtext, right? So I might have just insinuated that you should be studying your vocab by saying, if you haven't studied your vocab, you might have trouble with this question, right? I insinuated, if you want to do better with a question like 2, you should study vocab. I didn't say it explicitly until now, but earlier I just insinuated it. All right, so if you're missing this one, you probably aren't realizing that agitate has more than one definition. How are we going to figure that out? By studying vocabulary. And that's what you should be doing if you're missing a question like 2. All right, so question 3 here on module 1 of 305 is another word and context question. So this one doesn't really follow any of the specific things that the SAT does to create difficulty. We don't have commonly confused words. We don't have words that all sound the same, but let's just go through all of these definitions and make sure we understand the logic of the text, because that's our first step. We need to know what kind of words should we put here based on the logic. So the passage basically says that there was a strict criteria that ensured astronauts could handle the extreme conditions of spaceflight. But now seemingly kind of feeble or pathetic people, right, are going to space or trying to go to space, even if they are not as strong as what we had up here. Okay, so in the past, they had to have STEM degrees, exceptional physical fitness, etc. Now we have people as old as 90 who are going into space. So we're looking for something to say, intense requirements, strict requirements, strong requirements, something like that, right? So striking. Striking doesn't work, right? Striking sounds sort of close. Okay, striking can mean kind of like strong or appealing, right? Someone with striking looks means they stand out. But striking here doesn't work because there isn't no surprise to these requirements, right? They make a lot of sense, right? So stringent, as you probably know, is the correct answer choice here. Let's talk about why stringent is the correct answer choice. When something is stringent, it means it is strong, it is confining, but it doesn't have any sort of negative connotation, really. It just means that it's strict, okay? Sometimes it can have a negative connotation, not conjugation, excuse me. It can have a negative connotation sometimes if it's talking about like a social thing or a family thing, right? Like my mom's rules are very stringent, right? That could maybe have a little bit of a negative connotation, but typically just means, strict, precise, strong necessities, or especially in the context of a guideline, okay? Powerful requirements. Doesn't make any sense at all, okay? Maybe you would need to be powerful, but to have powerful requirements would mean requirements that exude a lot of power, right? Somebody who is powerful would be maybe the principal or the superintendent, right? A requirement wouldn't be powerful. Doesn't make sense. Now, draconian. This is a really, if you don't know exactly what stringent means, you might be leaning towards draconian. But we have to remember the SAT is asking us about connotation as well. When something is draconian, it typically means it's punitive. Now, what does that mean, punitive? That means that it's like punishing, okay? A draconian society would be one that perhaps goes around rounding up people because of, arbitrary things such as where they were born and putting them in internment camps. That would be a draconian society. Uh, yeah. Um, Draconian societies or something that's draconian is very strict, right? You could even say that certain rules might seem draconian at your school, right? I'm tardy by 10 minutes, I have to go to detention. That seems draconian. It means too far. Whereas stringent just means that it's strict, it's precise. To be draconian means that that sort of strictness goes too far to the point of being negative, all right? So differences in connotation is what leads us to B as opposed to D, and it's a good question. If you're missing this, probably should be studying your vocab. All right, so question 4 here on module 1 of 305 is another word and context question. It does something that we see the SAT do a lot, which is put a lot of these similar sounding words next to each other so that we sort of get lost as to what's really going on here. So we really want to think of what the meaning needs to be up here, what kind of word we want here. Okay, so what kind of word do we want? We're talking about writing that is so ornate that it disrupts the narrative flow, right? It gets in the way. We have, it was a dark and stormy night, all right, as a classic example. So it's like ornate or trite. It just sort of is bad and it loses meaning, okay? And it disrupts the narrative. So we're looking for something that means something along the lines of like disruptive or lost or kind of awkward or something like that. The perfect word for that is ponderous. Okay. Now you might be thinking to yourself, to ponder, doesn't that mean to think? Right? Wouldn't something that is ponderous be like well thought out or deeply considered or something like that? But no. Okay, ponderous, especially when it's used for writing or speaking or what have you, is when it's like overwrought, kind of lost, wandering, useless writing or speaking. Okay. The word salad is kind of is similar to ponderous. So let's say what some of these other words are. So precocious. When something is precocious, it means it's smart, but too young. Okay. Sometimes it doesn't have a negative connotation. Sometimes it kind of has a negative connotation, but really it just means when someone or something is really young and really good, right? So Mozart was really precocious. He wrote the melody to Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star when he was 5 years old or something. I don't know if that's an urban myth or not, right? Doesn't fit here. Now, profound, it's kind of an opposite distractor, right? If something is profound, it means it's really deep, okay? Like you might think ponderous meant, but profound is in the positive way, okay? And finally, perilous means it causes hazard, right? It's dangerous. It can cause danger to other people, right? If you don't know what ponderous means, you might be choosing perilous because it's the only word that you might think really has a negative connotation here. But it's not the right negative connotation, okay? Walking across a log that fell across a river, that's perilous, right? Alligators are perilous. Writing, probably not perilous just because it's ornate and disruptive. Ponderous, though, is the perfect word for it. So this is another example of know your vocab, learn your vocabulary. If you're missing a question like this, you might assume you know what the word ponderous means because you know what to ponder means, but you don't know what ponderous means if you missed this question. But it's in vocab, right? It's one of those words that you would learn and get this question right on the SAT. So that's my advice to you. Okay, so question 5 here on module 1 of test 305. Another word in context question that does one of the most classic SAT distractors ever. We see two words that are very commonly confused: vindictive and vindicated. All right, let's just clarify off the front end. What is vindictive versus what is vindicated? When something or someone is vindicated, it means that they are proved correct. All right, in a court of law, if you're vindicated, it means you've been proven that you're either that you're not guilty, let's say, right? Or if it's that you're the plaintiff, that the other person's guilty, right? When something is vindictive, it means it's kind of like callous, all right, to use another SAT vocab word. Okay, it means to be mean-spirited and hoping or trying to cause somebody to lose, right? Uh, it's basically like wanting to get revenge, okay? Wanting to avenge something. If you're vindictive, it means someone cut you off on accident getting into the freeway, so you cut them off getting off the freeway. That would be a vindictive act, okay? So let's make sure we understand the logic of this passage, right? The logic of the passage is that Lamarck's theories of evolution were seen as kind of like the most flawed thing for a long time. Though nowadays with epigenetics, we see that he's kind of partially proven correct. That's exactly what vindicated means, right? So we work here perfectly, right? Venerated means basically like when you hold something up in really high regard. It was used primarily for like religious figures, or like maybe you would have a venerated ancestor in a shrine, or maybe you would have a venerated saint or patron saint or something like that in a alcove. That's what it means to venerate. To be partially venerated goes too far, right? Even if he's proven correct that he isn't worshipped. And then inveterate is basically like when you have a really deep-seated habit that's usually a bad habit. So like maybe you have kind of like an inveterate like habit of tapping your pencil while you're taking a test, right? It kind of is annoying. Everybody's like, stop, right? But you just can't help it. And, that person's not going to change it anytime soon. You hear it a lot of time with vices, things like drinking or gambling or smoking. Okay. So either way, all these other ones don't work. Vindictive versus vindicated. Vindicated means to come out approved. Vindictive means to go on a revenge tour. So that's why we end up with D. Okay, so this question 6 here is the final question of Module 1's Word and Context section for Test 305. We have a number of words here. This is a very difficult one. These are hard vocab words here, even if they don't sound really hard. Looking to make sense of this. Okay, so we have to understand the logic of the passage first. So what is the logic of the passage? We see that David Lynch is a cult figure typically known by film fans, right? Nonetheless, he's had a really big influence on the wider industry, influencing horror to surrealist drama, right? His series Twin Peaks was groundbreaking and influenced, shows that you probably know and love, The X-Files and Stranger Things. Okay. But despite that, he remains typically known by film aficionados, and he didn't achieve mass audiences or high ratings. His final show, even though it's been called one of the best of the 21st century, still is niche. Okay, so we're looking to say something along the lines of, right, in this logic, that his influence is really big compared to how much commercial success he's had, right, or widespread success. So what word does that? Outsize. Okay, what is the definition of outsize? Outsize means when the impact of something is either larger or smaller than what's expected. Okay. It actually fits this perfectly. The definition of outsize is perfect. Okay. Now you might think, oh, outsize is like, when something is big outside, right? But in this case, it really just refers to when something is kind of like proportionally large, right? Ants have an outsized strength. They're able to carry much more than you would think they would based on how small they are. Things like that, right? Distended is when something's bloated, typically with like death. Not quite right. Things can be infectious, right? Positively infectious laughter. An infectious influence would kind of, it isn't something that you would never hear said before. But we need to think about the logic of this, which is to say that his influence is bigger than you would expect given how his work has performed commercially, right? So infectious doesn't work because outsize works better. Finally, exquisite means it's really well done, but that doesn't work here. That doesn't make any sense, which is how we write outsize. With that, we finish up the word and context for module 1, and we'll move on to the rest of the reading section here. All right, so question 7 here is our first kind of like non-vocab question of our first module here on test 305. Really good question. It's asking about the purpose of the underlined sentence within the context of the passage. So we have to really understand the context here, all right? This sentence says that cancer cells are more perfect versions of ourselves. Outside of context, that's a very strange idea, right? Outside of context, it might sound like it's saying something about how they are better than us, right? Or that they are somehow very, uh, something, right? But really, in the context of this, we see that when they say that cancer cells are more perfect versions of ourselves, shows that cell division is what allows us to live, right? Allows us to grow, to adapt, to recover, to repair, to live. And then cancer cells do those same things really well, but even better than we can, right? It repairs faster than us. It recovers faster than us. It adapts faster than us. It flourishes, right? They grow faster than us. So they're the same thing as us, but they just do it better. They're more perfect versions of ourselves, right? And it's unsettling to say that, right? That cancer cells are better than they're more perfect. But that within the context is what's being claimed, right? Uh, they're structurally superior and more advanced. That's too much of a qualitative argument, right? That there's too much of a value there. I don't think that fits within the context of this passage either whatsoever, right? This is sort of, they're saying this to hint at something unsettling. The guy isn't literally saying that they're better than us. They're more perfect than us in a positive sense. Uh, this is completely untrue. They are not fundamentally distinct from normal cells, right? They're actually very similar to normal cells. And then finally, they function in a way that is natural yet alien. Not true, right? It is not alien to the human body. It is exactly the same as the human body, and they come from the human body. Natural, sure, but yet alien does not make sense. So, something wrong with B, C, and D, but something correct with A. That's how we arrive there for this question. All right, so for question 8, if you're watching this video, it means you got it wrong, most likely. You have, of course, though, taken this question, if you're watching this, meaning you've read the passage. So I'm not going to read the passage for us, but I am going to go right here. I'm going to use this to show what is compelling about some of our wrong answer choices, but why they nonetheless are wrong. All right, so first off, I want to point out to something like C. Okay, C is wrong, but it uses this word tyranny that we see up here in the text, tyranny. This is what we call a recycled language distractor. Just because we're using tyranny over and over again doesn't mean that this is going to be a correct answer choice. This says the tyranny of lower quality digital music platforms, whereas here we're talking about the tyranny of choice, right? So it isn't about the fact that CDs are better, right, compared to digital music platforms. That's not discussed at all in this passage, right? It's just talking about some of the problems of streaming in terms of user experience compared to with CDs. So even though tyranny is in C and tyranny is in the passage, C isn't correct, right? Uh, so B, while B might be true, the statement is true. The pervasiveness of modern streaming sources has eroded the impact or the feasibility of in-car CD players. While that might be true, is that what this underlined sentence is saying? No, this underlined sentence is saying exactly the opposite. It's saying that the pervasiveness of modern streaming sources or services has made the writer of this article kind of wish they had in-car CDs. Okay. Uh, now, A, uh, she does say that there might be some attractiveness to older in-car CD players, but given the advantages, as though there's a specific advantage, is she arguing that CD players are better than streaming in a particular specific way? Not necessarily, right? She's saying that this preference is unfounded given the advantages. No, right? That's too extreme. Okay, so the only answer choice that has nothing wrong with it is D, and let's talk about what's right with it. So, the tyranny of choice, the overwhelming number of options, these mean the same thing. You create a sense of longing for simpler, more personal listening experiences, right? This is simpler, right? Okay, perfect. So that's how we arrive to D by getting rid of A, B, and C and seeing that D both has nothing wrong with it and says the right thing. All right, this next question 9 is going to be a little bit awkward to go through in the video because the question and the answer choices are separate from one another, but let's just look at our answer choices here essentially. We are being asked to understand the main idea of the text. So if you're watching this video, it means you've taken this test, which means you've probably read the text that we have here. So let's take some time to go through just the main idea of the text, which is basically that sown wildflower meadows and what it, I forget exactly. Wildflower meadows found in natural settings have ultimately very similar compositions in terms of species richness, of pollinators, and they were very effective. Even if there was a higher quantity of butterflies in the natural meadows, there is a very positive comparison between the two, and that they would be a compelling option for urban planners. So now we will go to the text, the answer choices itself, and let's just go through why each of them are wrong and why the correct one is correct. So yes, they are smaller, but they have reduced applicability in alleviating issues. The final sentence in the text disavows that exactly, right? The final sentence says they do have a applicability in alleviating issues of habitat loss. So to say that they don't have applicability is false, right? Uh, Now, B, everything up until this comma is really good, but then we have this here. More efficient in increasing biodiversity than natural meadows. That's not something that's stated in the text. The text is not saying that we should replace natural meadows with sown wildflower meadows. It's saying that sown wildflower meadows are an effective supplement or replacement when they're in the urban context. Uh, Now, C makes a claim that is very reasonable, but is not stated in the text, right? The main idea of the text is that natural and sown wildflower meadows both offer good things for pollinators, and sown wildflower meadows are a good option for those who are trying to mitigate or reduce the undesirable outcomes of urbanization, right? So sown wildflower meadows are a good thing for urban planners. That's the main idea. Here it says the main idea is that natural meadows offer ecological advantages that sown meadow wildflowers don't. That might be true, right? Because yeah, we do see that there is more butterflies in natural meadows than sown wildflower meadows. But is that the main idea? No, okay, so this is a true but irrelevant distractor, which is really hard to get rid of. But ultimately, the main idea of this text isn't to say natural wildflower meadows are better than sown wildflower meadows for X, Y, and Z. It's to say, even though there's some differences, right, which is what they say here, the similarities between sown wildflower meadows and natural wildflower meadows means that they can alleviate some of the adverse ecological effects of urbanization. Perfect. Right? That's exactly what we're looking for. So if you're missing this, watch out for distractors. Okay, you probably have a hard time distinguishing between certain distractor types that are particularly difficult to navigate on the SAT. All right, so question 10, we have another main idea question, meaning we have to understand what the passage says as a whole and focus on the fact that the passage works as a whole rather than just any particular claim in the passage. All right, so um, ultimately, this is about how California is a leader in solar energy production, yet has some issues in terms of using it because they have insufficient battery storage, inadequate transmission, etc. All right. So here we have some too extreme or what have you distractors. I'm going to talk about what's wrong in all these. So A is very clearly wrong. If you chose A, you probably didn't read this passage. You were parroting something out of your own head. All right. Um, so is it a contributing factor to high electricity rates? Sure. Right. But is it the result of its reliance on solar energy and lack of alternative energy solutions? No. All right. Um, so the fact that California doesn't have sufficient battery storage might contribute to high electricity rates, but it isn't the result. The high electricity rates aren't the result of that, nor is it a reliance on solar energy. So that's a too extreme distractor. B is our correct answer here. So oversupply has exposed significant grid and storage limitations. Okay, perfect. That's what we have up through here. And it results in issues that limit economic benefits, which we see here, and hinder attempts to reach statewide renewable energy goals, right? Which is stated up here. Okay. So basically, every element of B is stated in the text, and it is all true to the text, and that's clearly the main idea. C. This is a Finding Nemo distractor baggage. You're going too far. You're reading outside of what the text specifically or explicitly says to find things that are beyond that, right? So even though and then again, it also says it's kind of a zero-sum game that California has put too much in solar power as there is at the direct detriment of storage technology and grid enhancement, right? Was that claimed in the passage? No. Doesn't say that California focused on expanding production at the cost of other things. Now, finally, D is kind of a misinterpretation, right? So yes, surplus energy is going to neighboring states, which helps them reach their renewable energy benchmarks. But this isn't an effective oversupply, right, situation. This is another issue. So ultimately, B states the main idea. All of these other answer choices either state only part of the idea, or they overstate or overinterpret what's from the facts in the passage, or they misinterpret the facts of the passage to make a different claim. All right, so 11 is a pretty straightforward, simple question, but the text itself is kind of long and difficult. So if you miss this question, it's probably a result of that. But I just want to point this out. According to the text, that means we have a detail question here, okay? That means we're looking at a detail from this text to answer the question. So, what was a problem with the team's first artificial photosynthesis device? Well, something that they used to enable water splitting had the unintended drawback of poisoning the microbes. Right, so we know that this was the first official artificial device in 2015. So that's why it's A, right? That's a direct claim that is right there, right? So directly from the text, just like we want with the detail question, A does everything we're expecting and it's correct. All right. We don't know anything about whether they could or could not generate solar electricity. Uh, so we don't really know that. We don't have we don't see anything about this, and we don't see anything about this, right? So these would all be, true problems if following through this, you see what the device is supposed to do, right? They're supposed to convert CO2 to alcohol fuels, right? Like we're supposed to do a whole bunch of different things. If any of those things failed, that would be a problem with the device. But the only thing that's specifically attested to is A. So that's how we get that for question 11. All right, so question 12 here is a command of evidence question. That means we need to connect something from our answer choices to the claims made in the passage. All right. So we are trying to undermine, make sure you're seeing undermine the claims made by Professor Claudia Glatz and her team. All right. So uh, B is correct, right? So let's get to that point, right? What is Glatz's claim? Well, Glatz's claim and her team suggest that the inhabitants of Shakikora rejected these structures being institutions of centralized state institutions, okay? They rejected these structures in favor of decentralized systems, and that this was a deliberate transition. Why do we know that? Well, because it appears to be peaceful, marked by the absence of evidence for violent conflict or environmental calamities. Instead, it shows a reorganization, blah, 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 right? So why does B undermine this claim so well? Well, it shows things that are contrary to the facts that she found and her team found to support their claims. So they said it was a peaceful thing. Well, that shows it's not peaceful, right? So that is why B would be correct. Okay. Uh, so her claim isn't that this is talking about a separate claim, right? Her claim isn't that this was unique here. It's just that they abandoned state institutions. That's all the claim is. This has nothing to do with that claim. Uh, Here, okay, so she says, yeah, environmental calamities were not present. This says perhaps there was, though, negligibly impactful drought, right? Intermittently. Okay, so intermittent periods of negligibly impactful drought is not an environmental calamity. So this would not undermine the claim. This would be fully within the support of the claim. And then finally, D suggests these things up here were built by central institutions. Sure, that could 100% be true and not undermine the claims of Professor Glatz and the rest of her team. So that's how we arrive to B for this command of evidence question. All right, so question 13, we have a command of evidence question here. We are being asked to find information from the table that supports the sociologist's claims. So what is the sociologist's claim? Well, that while German has been the most claimed ethnic group, that's a consequence of how the questions are asked in the census. They think by changing the way it's asked, you will see that English ancestry is the most common ancestry in America. So what from this table here, sorry, from this table here would support the claim that English ancestry is the most common ancestry in the US if the question was asked a little different? Well, we know our correct answer is D, and how do we support that? Well, when we're asked only about single origin, German is higher, right? But once we put these two together, we see that in fact, English is the most common ancestry altogether when you put them both together. So, a lot of these are true, but they just don't respond to the sociologist's claims about German and English ancestry, right? Um, like this is true, but what does this have to do about German ancestry and English ancestry English being the most common ancestry? Unclear. Uh, Same with A, it's unclear how that's relevant. Um, and then finally C, same thing, right? This is true perhaps, but does this align with the sociologist's claim down here? No, right? So make sure we're understanding what the sociologists claim rather than just answering what's interesting about this table. All right, so question 14, we are asked about a command of evidence question, right? So we're linking a claim with what the researcher's qualifications are. So you look at the study, which is about recently in California, fast food workers got a new minimum wage of $20 an hour. There were all these claims in the media that such a change, such a minimum wage for fast food workers would cause all these sort of problems. But the study says that the average pay rose a lot. However, even with this high raise in pay, employment did not go down. Meanwhile, food prices changed very little, with consumers only absorbing about 62% of those cost increases, which shows that this is all very benign, right? Uh, so wages went up significantly, employment didn't change, food prices didn't change much. So awesome. It was a really, really great decision by the state of California to do that. And the people opposed were, likely motivated by their own self-interest or greed. Now, our task here, though, is to say which of these would most directly challenge the researchers' qualifications that the effects were benign. Um, what would say that? Well, if they are saying that the raise of food prices by 3.7% is benign, well, it wouldn't be benign if that led to a sustained decline in consumer demand, right? That would mean, okay, this is no longer a good thing, right? I'm doing red because it's bad for the claim, but that's what we actually want. We want to undermine the claim. We want to challenge the claim. So that's why B is correct, right? Uh, A would undermine their claim that this was a good thing, but is this undermining the claim of being benign? No, it's irrelevant to whether it's benign or not. Okay? Uh, Completely irrelevant to whether it's benign or not. It would challenge perhaps the need for doing this wage increase. However, whether it's benign or not is actually completely irrelevant to what is said in answer choice A. So if you selected A, you are not reading the question. You are just presuming what is being asked of you, which you can never do on the SAT. And if you continue to do, you'll continue to miss questions. So be focused on that. Uh, C is that's that would be the opposite of benign. That would be positive. So that would not I mean that not the opposite of benign. It's even more than benign. It's a positive thing. So that would not undermine the idea that they're benign. And then this other sectors means that we're dealing with variables that are unrelated to the criteria of the research conducted, right? So that is why D is incorrect. So that's how we ultimately arrived to B being correct, and A being probably our closest difficult distractor to get rid of because it's not referring to what the question is actually asking, but instead refers to what you might presume the question would ask. So make sure you read the question in order to determine what you select. All right, so question 15 is a bit of a tricky question here. We really need to understand what the researcher's hypothesis is, right? So their hypothesis is that burrowing animals in a volcano's eruption zone, right, basically in the devastation, introducing burrowing animals there will accelerate ecological recovery, right? How would they do that? They would bring bacteria and fungi to the top layers of the soil, not soil, which would therefore facilitate restoration. So, what we would need to see in order to support that hypothesis is where burrowing activity took place, we have a higher level of bacteria and fungi and a higher restoration of ecology compared to areas of the volcanic zone, the devastation, without burrowing activity, right? So we can only compare burrowing activity to non-burrowing activity within areas impacted by the volcanic eruption. So the only answer choice which does that is D, right? We're within the volcano's eruption zone. Good. And it's within the gopher plots, which, as we know, are the burrowing mammals. They have a higher diversity, the gopher plots within the eruption zone, than areas of the eruption zone which did not have the gophers. All right. So burrowing within the eruption zone has higher diversity than areas of the eruption zone which didn't have burrowing. That is why D is correct. Let's go through. Okay. C, we compare the right things. We compare gopher plots to non-gopher plots. But the gopher plots should not have a lower diversity. They should have a higher diversity. B, okay, this starts out very promising. Except we are now comparing nearby montane forests to the eruption zone. All right. We are outside of the parameters that we're allowed to consider. We have to be completely within the eruption zone, both parameters, or both variables, rather. Finally, A. Okay, good. Burrowing activity zones within the eruption zone have a high diversity compared to, though, nearby montane forests, right? So these both compare the wrong variables, and C compares the correct variables but has a wrong solution to support the findings. So only D has the correct variables, leading to the correct conclusion to support the hypothesis. Right, so 16, we have our inference question here, which means we have to understand the logical structure and reasoning of everything that gets to this point. All right, so what is the passage saying we need to understand? So the passage is comparing intermittent exercise, the weekend warrior type, right, with daily continuous exercise up here. But it isn't comparing how much muscle you build between the two. It is comparing the cognitive benefits. So what is cognitive? The brain. Okay. So we are comparing the cognitive benefits of brief, high intensity weekend warrior exercise versus continuous daily low intensity exercise. So despite initial skepticism, so that means we might have thought it would be no good to do the weekend warrior. Researchers saw unexpected outcomes. Okay. So if the expectation is it's not going to do good, unexpected outcomes means it did well. So what do we need to find here? Logically, that intermittent exercise has cognitive benefit. So why does C show that? Okay. Remember, we can infer by the opposite. If intermittent exercise means you have periods of activity, it means you also have a period of inactivity. Okay? So this is the same thing as intermittent exercise. Finally, cognitive benefits has to do with the brain. So memory enhancing. We know by very easy inference that memory enhancing has to do with cognitive. All right? So that is why C is correct. We connect weekend warrior intermittent with this, and we connect cognitive with memory enhancing. Now, A seems really good, except we're talking about physical fitness, right? But are we supposed to be talking about physical fitness? No. We're supposed to be talking about cognitive performance. B, okay, we're talking about cognitive performance, good, but the logic says that this is surprising. This doesn't make sense, right? It wouldn't be surprising for continuous exercise to have better benefits if experts had skepticism. That doesn't make sense either. Finally, D, again, it goes against the logic, which is that the logic has to say that intermittent exercise provides benefits equal to, unexpectedly equal to continuous exercise. So that is how we arrive to C for question 16. With that, we finish up the reading section and move on to the writing section for 305. All right, so moving on here, we have question 17 of module one. This is our first grammar type question on this SAT. This is a pretty tricky question if you're moving too quickly. All right, so one thing that the SAT really loves to do is provide us with questions that on the punctuation side look as though they're simple, easy fixes that follow a common thing, but actually don't. All right, so if you miss this question, I have a feeling you selected A. And I have a feeling you selected A because you see here a list, right? And sometimes we can introduce lists using a colon. But remember, we can only introduce a list using a colon if what comes before the list is an independent clause, and so long as that colon doesn't interrupt the list. But when we read this all the way through, these differences include behavioral differences, size, ear length, and tail length, right? You'll recognize, oh, behavioral differences is one item in the list, along with size, ear shape, and tail length. Okay? So if you were to think that you need to put a colon there, you didn't recognize that behavioral differences is an item in this list, right? So that's why A doesn't work. B doesn't work because on either side you would need to have an independent clause and need to stand on its own as a sentence. And I don't think any of us would think that size through environments makes sense as a independent sentence. And then finally, C, we're missing the comma here between our first item in the list and the rest of the items in the list, right? So behavioral differences, size, ear length, and tail length. So what do we have here? We have, why does D work? Well, D, we have our which, our kind of non-essential signifier leading to the rest of this sentence. And we have each item in the list separated by a comma, behavioral differences, comma, size, comma, ear length, comma, and tail length, comma, which is exactly what we need here. So I think that that's pretty understandable now that we take a moment and we look and we see what this text is actually saying. It's pretty clear that we couldn't put a colon there because you really couldn't put a period there. These differences include behavioral differences, size. You couldn't put a period after that, right? Now, I will say, if I were writing this in a paper, I might not say these differences include behavioral differences. I might say maybe something along the lines of these distinctions or whatever. Um, so we don't repeat differences twice in like four words. But ultimately, that's irrelevant, right? What's relevant here is making sure that we're not using that colon erroneously and we're making the list as we're supposed to. All right, question 18 here is another punctuation question from the SAT. We're being asked about what we call coordinate adjectives, or how do we put more than one adjective in front of a particular noun? So what's our noun here? Four-legged canine, okay? And we're trying to figure out is a few, actually our adjective isn't, or our noun isn't four-legged canine. Our noun is canine, okay? That's our noun, canine. Now, what we are being asked is we have a couple of adjectives, furry and four-legged, and then we have this few qualifier, okay? So few isn't exactly working as an adjective here. Few isn't describing what kind of canines we have. It's describing how many we have. So we do not need a comma between few and furry or anything else. So that's why we can get rid of B. Now, why would we need a comma between furry and four-legged? Like, because we know that answer choice A is correct. Why do we need a comma there? So we need a comma between furry and four-legged because furry describes the canine, right? The adjective furry describes the noun canine, as does the adjective four-legged describe the noun canine. Each of these describes the noun canine. They don't describe each other. So if each adjective in the list of adjectives describing a noun describes the noun, we need to put a comma between those adjectives so that it's not unclear whether the adjective describes the noun or whether the adjective describes the adjective. Okay, so that's why A is correct. And I'll help this even more by discussing why something like D is incorrect. Furry four-legged without the comma suggests that furry is the type of four-leggedness it is, right? Um, and though their forelegs are furry, furry is not describing the four legs, right? Furry is describing that we've got these little furry coyotes swimming across the straits of Tiburon. All right. So that is why D is incorrect. Now, finally, okay, you might be thinking, see, I mean, we have the comma here. We don't have a comma after few. Everything's good. But remember, there's a comma after our final adjective and before the noun. We never want to see a comma between our adjective and our noun, right? That doesn't make any sense. We would never say, my tall, comma, teacher is teaching me about grammar right now, right? You just say, my tall teacher. So one way to easily think about this is if you could switch the adjectives, a few four-legged furry canines, then that means you need to have a comma between them. Or if you could put an and between the adjectives, a few furry and four-legged canines, then it means you have to have a comma between the adjectives. So a bunch of ways to test this, but ultimately we need a comma between them because that's what we do with these two different adjectives, which are each qualifying the same noun. All right, 19 is a very tricky and very good SAT question, one which we see commonly asked by the SAT. So I want to remind us of something. Transitional adverbs, like our word however, okay? However, which is in all of these here, can appear anywhere in a sentence, all right? They can appear at the beginning of a clause, or when I say sentence, I mean clause, independent clause, okay? So they can appear at the beginning of an independent clause, they can appear at the end of an independent clause, they can appear in the middle of an independent clause. It doesn't matter where they appear in terms of being in the clause, but it does matter that they are in the correct clause logically for what the passage is saying. So we need to think about the logic of this passage. All right, the logic of this passage says, Seminole Maroons built communities that were autonomous from their indigenous neighbors. So what does that exactly mean? Built communities that were autonomous from their indigenous neighbors. That means that autonomous means separate from, not in one unity, okay? So they're not together. The Seminole Maroons, right, who were these escaped African slaves that were living in the Everglades, they had their own communities, and then the Seminole tribes people had their own communities nearby. And even though they were close to one another, they were autonomous. But despite their autonomy, right, despite the fact that they were separate from one another, they fought together in the Seminole Wars, all right? So that means the pivot must come within this clause here. So however is our pivot. That means however, as a transitional adverb, must appear in the clause that goes from they fought alongside the Seminoles to Seminole Wars. So how do we do that? It could have come at the beginning. If I was writing on this on my own, if I was writing this for a paper, I probably would have put it on the beginning. However, the Seminole Maroons fought alongside the Seminoles during the long and brutal Seminole Wars, semicolon. Many historians argue that without the support of the Maroons, the Seminoles might not have been able to resist U.S. forces for as long as they did. That's how I would have constructed the sentence if I was writing this in an essay. But it doesn't matter whether, however, comes at the beginning, in the middle, or the end of that first independent clause of the final sentence. It just matters that it comes in that clause and no other clause. So the only answer choice which puts, however, in the correct clause, the first clause of this last sentence, is C. It needs to come there because the logic means that first clause is pivoting from the previous sentence, which says they lived apart from one another. Despite living apart, they fought together. All right. Now, I'm going to show you why A is wrong, right? I'm sure if you missed this one, you probably selected A because this is, something we see very conventionally. A semicolon, then our transitional adverb, then a comma, then the rest of the clause. Why can that, however, not come in our second clause? Because it doesn't make sense logically, right? They fought alongside the Seminoles during the long and brutal Seminole Wars. However, many argue that without their support, they might not have been able to resist US forces for as long as they did. That doesn't make any sense. Why would we be pivoting there? We're saying they fought alongside the Seminole Native tribe, but by fighting alongside them, they were really helpful. A but doesn't make any sense there. It's building on the previous idea or goes with the previous idea. So to put however in that second clause, like you do with A, makes it illogical. D, we're missing the comma. We always need a comma, either introducing our transitional adverb or setting it apart from the rest of the clause, so before or after. And then B creates a run-on, right? You need to separate these two clauses here, and with just a comma and a transitional adverb, we're not separating them. We need a semicolon, a period, something like that here. So that's why C is our best answer choice, all right? We have our two independent clauses separated properly by a semicolon, and we have our transitional adverb in the proper side of the semicolon, being in the first independent clause of this final sentence. This is a tricky one, but when we read it logically and we're reading for meaning, which is ultimately the goal of all this, it should be straightforward why A, B, and D are all wrong, and therefore we should be able to arrive at C as our correct answer. So question 20 here is our first form function sense, form structure sense question. It's a grammar question dealing with verb tense, in particular helping verbs, all right? So if you've done this question and you're watching this, you probably know that our correct answer is C. I want to tell us why C is necessary, why we need this auxiliary verb, what we can call a helping verb, has continued, rather than just working or rolling with something like continued, all right? Why do we need the has continued? Why we need it is because there's a time referent, all right? Even after departing in 2003. Okay, so we have a time referent at the beginning. He has continued to make music, including some things in recent years, all right? That means we have to show that this tense, that this action that Jason Schwartzman is doing began in the past and continues to the present, right? It has a time determinant at the beginning and a time determinant going out until the end. So it is ultimately our present perfect tense, I believe. All right. Began in the past, continues in the present, right? We need to say that. Just putting it in the simple past with continued means that something is unclear, right? It would mean that when did he begin this? When did he continue to make music, right? When did he stop making music? If those things were not defined within the sentence, they were not referred to, then continued would work. But because they're referred to, we cannot use continued. It is too vague. It suggests something else, right? Rio has been a teacher. So I'm Rio, right? Rio has been a teacher for 4 years, suggests I'm a teacher currently. Rio was a teacher for 4 years. Now we don't know, right? Is Rio currently a teacher? It sounds like maybe not, right? Since 2020, Rio has taught English. That suggests I'm still doing it and it began at some point, right? Since 2020, Rio taught English, we wouldn't be able to say. Okay, was continuing to make music suggests that it's done. Was continuing is better than continued, really, because it has the initial time referent, but we would suggest was continuing suggests that it's ended at some point. We don't have that in this sentence. And then will continue is in the future, but this is all still happening in the past and the present. It's not happening in the future. So that's why we arrive to C here, okay? Make sure you're really looking for the time reference to determine what kind of tense we've got going on for any verb. Also, yeah, Jason Schwartzman, famous actor. It's a lot of California songs. Okay, so 21 is another question here on the grammar side of the SAT in Module 1. we have something that the SAT loves to do to make difficulty for their students. What does it do? Well, we have B looking like a really conventionally correct answer choice because we all know, comma fanboys, right? When we're connecting independent clauses, we have to use a fanboys like and a comma. And B does that. However, before we just automatically select B because we have the comma with the fanboys, we have to consider, do we actually connect two independent clauses here? Is and actually working as a fanboys here? And simply put, it isn't, right? What we're saying are two actions. We're just declaring, we're listing two verbs that a tiny crustacean does, right? This tiny crustacean plays and offers, right? The same way we could say that a decathlete runs. So decathletes, sorry, you might not know what a decathlete is. They're athletes in track and field who do all the events at once, right? So they're evaluated based on how good or how well they perform in a bunch of different events, right? So a decathlete runs and throws, okay? Prince, the famous musician, he sang and danced, right? You wouldn't put a comma between sang and danced. You wouldn't put a comma between wrote songs and sang them, right? Even though there's an and there, it's just coordinating or connecting two different verbs that are performed by the same subject. So they don't need to be two independent clauses. We just have the verb plays and offers. So B doesn't work because we're not connecting two independent clauses. We're just connecting two different verbs that are performed by the subject of this sentence, this single clause, the tiny crustacean, right? We have one subject, the tiny crustacean, two verbs, plays and offers, one sentence, one independent clause, right? As such, we go with A, where there's nothing that we put between our two verbs, right? The and just coordinates those two verbs, right? C doesn't make sense because we don't have an elaboration, right? Offering a unique window in a natural selection and evolution isn't about the fact that they live in freshwater ecosystems. I mean, millions of things live in freshwater ecosystems. Why would the water flea be particularly unique or offer a particularly good thing? Finally, D and C do the exact same thing, right? Using a dash to begin a elaboration, you can do that, or you could use a colon, but we don't have an elaboration here, so neither C nor D are correct. So if you missed this, it's very likely you selected B, going on a reasonable notion of, well, I see a fanboys, got to have a comma of fanboys if I'm connecting independent clauses, but you needed to pause and think and go, am I actually connecting independent clauses here, or do I just have two different verbs which I'm trying to coordinate? All right, so question 22 is our first transitions question of the test here in module 1. If you've taken this, if you're watching this video, you've probably looked at what was missed, and you'll see that the correct answer here is thereafter. If you didn't select thereafter, I presume that has something to do with maybe not knowing what thereafter is. It's a little bit of a less common transition. Basically, thereafter means from this point on, all right, or from that point forward. So we have a time referent here. This is a particular era, something that doesn't work. And then from that point on, basically going into the future, you see that we have a new form of cavalry, dragoons and pistoleros, etc. Right? So that means from that point forward. Okay. There, it sounds similar to therefore, but it doesn't mean the same thing, right? Therefore means consequently, means as a result. As a res we don't say that that something happened in the 30 Years' War that led to the new restructuring, right? If it had said, you know, the 30 Years' War in particular showed how awful heavily armored cavalry was, then therefore would make some sense. After all, it's kind of a consequently thing at the end of it all. Doesn't make sense for the same reason, therefore. And then, however, is a pivot, right? That would be to say the 30 Years' War showed that heavy cavalry didn't work anymore. Nonetheless, or however, cavalry still was used for a long time. That's not what we see here. So thereafter is best, which is why we go with D for question 22. All right, so 23 is our second transitions question. If you missed this, again, it's just a bit of a atypical transition word, but it's very common nonetheless. It's just not one of our four ones we see all the time. However, therefore, thus, yet, right? So, one thing that's really clear here is we actually have a subordinator here. We can't put a comma there. It doesn't make any sense because we have this comma here, right? This is a subordinate or a dependent clause starting this sentence off, whereas this is an independent clause starting this one off. So should sort of give away that, yeah, we kind of have to have a comparison thing here, and that comparison can't have a comma, right? So that's a little grammatical trick to lead us to the correct answer, but that's not why we're getting the correct answer, right? This is really about meaning. Um, all of these need to have, basically, all of these are wrong because they would suggest a pivot from the clause preceding this sentence, right? Nevertheless would be transitioning from the sentence before. Evidently would be transitioning from the sentence before. Consequently would be transitioning from the sentence before. However, because of the construction of the sentence, you have to read the whole thing. It's really clear that what we're actually doing is we're creating a comparison between the first clause of this second sentence and the second clause of the second sentence. The only one that does that is A. So that's why we arrive to whereas, which basically is a word that we use to create comparisons. So whereas XYZ in the United States, ABC in the rest of the world, maybe about health insurance or something like that, right? So that's why we arrive to whereas, which is our correct answer for question 23. All right, so for 24 on module one, there was a bit of a debate in the office as to whether it made sense to use on the other hand without having on the one hand in this paragraph. But looking into it deeply, you can totally have on the other hand without having on the one hand. So what does on the other hand mean? It just means on the other side of a debate, right? Here, if you read the structure or you read the passage, you understand its structure, you understand its meaning. We have two sides to one debate. We have the Federalists on one side and the Anti-Federalists on the other. So, on the other hand, is just saying on the other side of this two-sided issue. Okay, so it works perfectly. And I think if you're not selecting D, it is very likely that you are concerned about how, on the other hand, doesn't sound as sophisticated as something like correspondingly or hence, right? But these other words have incorrect meanings. And that is what all of this is about. Just about meaning. It's not about how nice it sounds or how academic it makes you seem. It's all about what meaning is conveyed and how do we demonstrate that meaning best, right? So what does hence mean? Hence means like thus. It means consequently. It's a cause and effect, prove it sort of thing. That doesn't work here, right? The Anti-Federalists are opposed on the other side of the Federalists. Correspondingly means something sort of similar. It means that as a result, it's something that makes sense, right? In correspondence. So you'd say correspondingly if, you know, the sun gives out a lot of heat every day, the sun uh, goes over the horizon and no longer provides heat. Correspondingly, the night is colder than the day, right? That's not the kind of argument that we have here. Finally, moreover means adding another claim to a previous claim or more evidence to an addition to provide additional information to a claim, right? It's a form of emphasis. So we would say, the Federalists believe this and that. Moreover, the Federalists believed this and that. Moreover, they didn't believe this and that, right? You're adding things to a previous claim, which we also don't have here. We just have talking about another side, which is on the other hand. It's the perfect meaning, even if it sounds to some degree less sophisticated than a fancy long word like correspondingly or a fancy seeming word like hence. All right, so 25 is our final transition question from Module 1. Here we have our correct answer as granted, which is a concession transitions. All right, so that's what we're looking for here to concede. So what does that mean? How do we know this? All right, so our first sentence shows something positive. Okay, it shows an advancement, right? Battery technology has made it possible to do all these things. But they do show that nonetheless, there is still room to grow, right? There still is work to do or advancements to make. So granted is our kind of concession there to do that. I chose this word for this question because I've seen it recently in SAT practice stuff. I think that they like this word because it's not one that you typically associate with transitions, right? Normally we're thinking of the classic however, right? But here we have something else. Okay, likewise means it goes similar to what was stated before, but this is a pivot, right? In fact, would make sense if this showed, wow, look at how awesome this is up here, but this claim here shows that it's not, in fact, demonstrating or emphasizing the claim that was made before. It's pivoting or conceding slightly. And then finally, conversely would be a complete role reversal pivot, right? It would be saying advances have made them more things. Conversely, advances in other technologies have made batteries obsolete, right? But what we just want is a concession. We don't want to go completely uh, to undermine the previous claim like conversely would. All right, so for 26, we have a rhetorical synthesis question. This is basically asking us to do the work that we normally would in school, okay? So we just want to make sure that we're demonstrator doing exactly what is asked. So we are being asked to showcase the resilience and diversity of the chaparral biome despite limited water and invasive species, okay? So we want our answer choice to show that the chaparral is diverse and resilient, and we want to show that nonetheless it faces issues with water resources and invasive species. So, um, uh, now we have some which are very close, but not quite right, right? So A, we have, resilience right there, good. Despite competition, good, right? We have diversity, right? Wide variety of species, good. But what's missing? Water resources. A is wrong for that, right? Um, okay. B, we have, okay, water conservation, meaning, right, limited water resources, good. Invasive species, good. Resilience, yes. But do we have diversity? No. All right. C, okay. C, we have discussion of uh, native plants and invasive species, good, but do we have anything about diversity or resilience readily? Well, we have diversity, good, but again, nothing about really resilience, nothing really about water. However, D has everything we need, right? So despite invasive species and hot, dry conditions, we have biodiversity due to for adaptations to water scarcity, right? So we show the resilience with this. We show water scarcity or water limited water resources with that. We show invasive species here, and we show biodiversity here. So this meets all of our criteria, which is how we get to D. All right, question 27 is our final question of Module 1 here. We are asked a rhetorical synthesis question to compare criticisms of different types of down. All right, so we want to make sure that we're talking about criticisms of different types of down that we read in these notes. You've done this question, you've read these notes, you've summarized these things to yourself at this point. So we're just trying to make sure that we compare criticisms of certain types of down correctly. So cost benefit analysis here is not something that was a criticism. It doesn't actually compare uh, correct criticisms. High cost is something that was a criticism, but this cost benefit analysis doesn't make sense, which is why we get rid of that. Um, here we have an incorrect statement about the criticisms, which is something that the SAT does, right? So synthetic down is not expensive and difficult to produce. It's just not very environmentally friendly. C, which is correct, does a very fair criticism of both types of down, right? Natural down has ethical issues and performs poorly when wet, while synthetic down is criticized for its environmental impact and non-biodegradability, right? So it has a negative environmental on the synthetic downside, whereas natural down doesn't do good when it's wet. And then finally, D doesn't really compare it. It gives an argument for, right? Um, so also it is not more environmentally conscious, which is why we can get rid of D. Okay. Um, so remember, the SAT on the trickiest rhetorical synthesis questions will include things in our answer choices which really aren't in the notes or aren't correct from the notes. So you got to make sure that when you're seeing an answer choice like B, which does a good criticism comparison, make sure that it doesn't lie about what those points are from the notes. And with that, we're done with module 1 and we'll move on to module 2. Okay, so now we move on to module 2 here, starting with our first question, a word and context question. So this question is a difficult one because it does something that the SAT loves to do, which is to use a word in a form that we might not most commonly associate with that word. So what do I mean by this? So precipitate. Okay, you're probably thinking about precipitation, rain, something like that. However, as you may have seen in chemistry or other sciences like that, precipitate means to kind of like come before and start or cause something, right? So in this case, when we read the logic of this passage, the logic of this passage says that the assassination of Franz Ferdinand was not is the spark that caused it, but it wasn't the sole cause of the war. And what really precipitated the war, like came before it and led to its eventual arrival, were all these other things, right? So that's what precipitate means. That's the exact definition of precipitate. It fits this context perfectly. But you might not even consider this correct word if you're thinking, well, precipitate, I'm just thinking of rain, okay? Now, you might be wondering, okay, why doesn't inspire work? Okay, serve to inspire war. Was war inspired here? Did war get a sudden, gust of inspiration from the multipolar alliance system? Or is it what, like, inspired others to go to war? Inspire can mean to cause something, right? In a sense, but not in this sense, not in this context. So remember on the SAT, the meaning and the context need to fit, okay? So while inspire can mean to start something in certain cases, within the context of this passage, it does not. To evoke war means to conjure like the feeling or the sentiment of it, right? So maybe Pablo Picasso's Guernica evokes the feelings of war, but evoke meaning to conjure something doesn't sit here. And now to declare war, that's something that we hear all the time, right? But did the multipolar alliance system, did that system declare war? No, they were bound to declare war because of the system, but the system itself didn't declare war. So that's illogical. So B, C, and D are all logical, and precipitate is perfect in this situation, but it's highly likely you just didn't know that precipitate means to cause something or to come before something, right? So if you're missing this question, you may have heard me say this before on some of these word and context before, you're going to need to study vocab. This is one of those words that's in our vocab list. It's one that the SAT highly likely to use because they love to use words that we know in one context, but not in another. All right, so question 2 does the same thing on module 2 that question 1 does, makes it difficult. It uses a word that we typically associate with one context in a different context. The correct answer choice, as you probably know, is express, which you might express some confusion about, because express typically has to do with showcasing something on, especially like emotion, right? We use art to express ourselves, to show ourselves. But to express something also means to showcase a scent, right? Stink bugs express, they'll express their little stink when they're agitated, when they're irritated or annoyed. All right. So express is a specific thing with sense, especially when talking about this here. All right. This is exactly the right context, exactly the right use, exactly something that you would see in any old article or any old write-up about food anywhere in the world, right? This is exactly the kind of thing that you'd see in everyday normal use. However, if you miss this question, it's likely that you wrote off the correct answer choice of A because you thought express had to do with feelings or emotions or thoughts, right? Now, convey and express can mean the same thing in certain situations, but not in this situation, right? So to convey essential oils would mean to transport them, right? In the same way, a conveyance belt might move things from one side of a factory to the other, right? So to convey means to carry, doesn't work in this case. To divulge means to give something away, right? But it has to do with like personal beliefs or secrets or something of that sort, right? You're not gonna like there's usually some sort of like unexpectedness of giving it away. And then finally, derive means to create something new out of something old. Okay, it means basically to create. Uh, we see this in math. Anyone in here who's taken calculus knows what a derivative is. It comes from deriving something, which means creating something out of something else. You're not deriving the essential oils. The essential oils were already there. You're simply expressing them, meaning to bring them out and showcase them. This is exactly how express works, especially when it's used with sense. So if you're missing this, studying some vocab and looking at the secondary, tertiary definitions of words will really help you out. All right, so question 3 here on module 2 is another word and context question. This one's difficult because it does something the SAT loves to do, which is give us some words that sound similar and give us some words with prefixes that might make sense. All right, so our correct answer is A here, incipient, right? You may have confused this word with insipid, which is kind of a bad meaning thing. When something is insipid, it's usually like really meek or weak, right? Lacking in a certain vigor. Incipient, though, means early on, right? Very early on in development, when something is, still in the developmental stage, right? Caterpillars, for example. So incipient fits here perfectly. If you know the definition of the word, it works perfectly, and it's a commonly used word, right? It doesn't quite mean developmental, it means that sort of era. Innocent can mean young, okay, but innocent doesn't really make any sense here. I think we can all kind of agree knowing what innocent means. Now, peremptory and preemptive. I want to talk about preemptive first. All right. So, preemptive might sound good to you because you're like, okay, pre, and then emptive, before something happens. We're talking about, before it was big, before it was a widespread social network. That makes sense. But preemptive means to do something to somebody before they do something to you, right? It's basically kind of like premature as well. So you would do it. So famously, right, the United States conducted preemptive attacks on Iraq because we had some delusion that they were going to attack us first. So we have to attack them first so they don't attack us first. Whether they would have attacked us first or not, you kind of lose whether that's possible once you've done a preemptive attack. Um, but basically, it's to preempt something, which means to uh, like stop it from starting. Okay, so stop it from starting. Um, so doesn't quite work. Okay. Peremptory sounds like it would come before something, but really it means um, kind of like you're kind of being annoyingly demanding, right? So someone's peremptory when they are like demanding something from you immediately when it doesn't really make sense. It's kind of in a rude way, right? Like asking someone like, it'd be like asking your DoorDash or Uber Eats person, like, "Where's my food?" Like 5 minutes after they said they picked up your food. Like, so you're being peremptory there. Okay, so uh, this is one of those ones where if you're studying vocab, you're gonna know these and you're gonna get this right. Even if you don't know every single one of these words, if you know what incipient, innocent, and preemptive are, and you don't know what peremptory means, well, you're gonna choose incipient. If you know what everything other than incipient means, we're still gonna choose incipient, right? So the more vocab you know, the better you're going to be able to apply strategy to arrive to the correct answer. So what would I recommend? Study more vocab. All right, so question 4 here of module 2, we've got another word and context question. Um, Here we have a couple of words with sort of similar meanings or seeming like they could have similar meanings, but only one works. And the one which works is probably one that you would arrive to last because you typically see the word in different formats. All right, this is a word I love to teach in class. If you're in my classes or one of my tutoring students, you'll probably know this bit. So issue, typically think it means a problem or a topic or maybe an edition of a magazine. But issue also means to emanate, right? Um, it means when something is coming out of something else, when it arises from something, right? On an SAT or an ACT from the past, they talk about the warm melodies of a ukulele issuing from across the room or issuing from the girl's ukulele, meaning those sounds emanating out of or arising out of the ukulele. So sensory things can issue from somewhere. All right. Um, so that's the correct answer because that word works perfectly here because we're looking to take this and synonym it with emanate or arose, and issue is the only one that does that. Promulgate. Okay, promulgate might sound like it means to kind of like arise out of, but promulgate is kind of like proselytize, another SAT type word that you should know that's used every day all around the world in a lot of different circumstances, right? Promulgate means to basically go around and try to like share your belief. Okay, so um, if people are going around and really trying to like make their idea, their belief, their cause known around the country or around their school or something like that, they're promulgating that idea. All right. Um, Now, extrude might also sound like the word exude, right? Which is kind of like coming out of somewhere. But to extrude means to force out. Okay. So you might say that like uh by it's kind of a gross word, and I feel like most of the examples I can think of are sort of gross. Um, you know, if you're let's say you have a calzone, all right, and you stab it, you might push on the calzone to extrude some cheese out of the calzone, or like a stuffed crust pizza, maybe the stuffed crust will extrude some cheese. So it's basically like something being forced out of something. All right. And now brood can mean a couple of different things. Brood can, on the one hand, it can be sort of like to glower or to sort of like be sad on your own, but of course that doesn't really make sense here. Um, It's like you're thinking too much, unhappy thoughts. And then it also can mean like a group of young animals, right? Sometimes you'll hear it in the context of like uh, scary stories or something like that, like the vampire's brood. Um, but it's like, like a bunch of maybe like a chicken can have like three broods a year or something like that. So none of those other words work. Issue works perfectly. This is tough because if you don't know the secondary or tertiary definition of issue, you're not going to understand that issue works here perfectly. And you're going to probably go for a word that you don't quite know what it means, like extrude or promulgate or something like that. So what's the solution here, y'all, to study your vocab? All right, so question 5 reveals that there's a big trend in this test, which is that the SAT is testing words like abandon, which you probably know in their primary use context, which abandon means to leave something behind, right? Like, the general might abandon his troops in a battle or something like that. But also can mean another thing. So doing something with complete abandon means to basically do it completely freely, right? So they can express these things freely. All right. Abandon works here perfectly. Expressing things with complete abandon is the most common way we might see the word abandon in this context. All right. However, if you don't know, abandon has more than one meaning, more than just to let something go. You might not think that this is a possible answer choice. You might think, it can't be desertion, which is true, because that means to leave something, right? In kind of a negative sense. So abandon and desertion must mean the same thing. But of course, abandon has this other meaning. Uh, Indulgence, to indulge something or to with complete indulgence means it kind of has a negative connotation or a connotation of going too far, uh, letting into just sort of like base pleasure or something like that. And then credulity has to do with believability, which also doesn't make sense here. Um, so here we're looking to say exactly what the word abandon means, but not in the context you're probably most familiar with abandon. So that's why it's correct. And if you're missing this, that's why you should study your vocab more so you get some of these secondary and tertiary definitions that the SAT loves to exploit. All right, this final question of the word in choice section, or word in context section, excuse me, of the test 305 is a really classic, difficult SAT style question where we have a word that sounds like another word, decorum, but doesn't mean the same thing as the word it sounds like. So you might think decorum has to do with decoration, right? It was all done up in Christmas decorum, but that's not what decorum means. Decorum is when you have propriety, okay? Uh, Decorum basically means certain acceptable actions that fit within a prescribed uh, social setting, right? So basically, it means manners. Um, so decorum fits perfectly with the logic of this passage, right? We read the logic of this passage, and it's basically saying there's all this formality, uh, that and these rules and propriety that we have in the English Parliament that therefore means we have to, it has a particular decorum. However, if you think decorum means decoration, you're going to say, no way, it's decoration. Also, ornamentation also means decoration. How on earth could it be decorum, right? Um, but that's not what decorum means. Okay. Temperance might be appealing to you because temperance might seem to be something along the lines of moderation, which it kind of is. Usually, though, temperance is referring to alcohol. But here, decorum actually perfectly describes the situation, whereas temperance is kind of askew, right? It's a little bit off from what it really is trying to say, which isn't moderation, but good, formal, civil manners. Finally, nuance. A lot of people seem to think nuance means like smart or moderate. We're in the middle. But nuance really just means when you follow the details of a thing to explain it fully rather than stereotypically, right? To describe a situation with nuance means to look at all the facets of the conversation. So nuance doesn't have anything to do with moderation necessarily. Sometimes there's a lot of nuanced takes or nuanced opinions, which are very moderate compared to other radical opinions. Um, but sometimes the nuanced take is a very radical one, right? Nuance just means to explore the details that go beyond kind of like typical talking points or buzzwords or what have you. So decorum means manners, which perfectly fits in with this passage here. So that's how we arrive to be. And how do we get that correct next time? You study your vocab. Hopefully by struggling through these 12 word and context questions between this module and the first module, you have learned some new vocab words and feel a little more implored to study your vocab on your own to improve on this really important section of the digital SAT. All right, so question 7 here in module 2 is our only cross-text analysis question on the test, which means we have to understand both of these passages to navigate this, okay? So, you read this when you did this test, but let's just clarify basically what each are saying, okay? So this first text is saying that great men, meaning great people from history, according to him, are what create history, right? In all times of the world's history, there is this quote unquote great man that saved his era, right? They were the lightning without which the fuel of the times would have burnt. Okay, so there's a metaphor here which we have to understand. Um, and he's complaining that people try to explain away the person that is the quote unquote great figure, right? So this is all an argument of saying, look, we need a particular heroic person to make the times happen. Okay, that was Thomas Carlyle. Then one of the most genius people of all time, Leo Tolstoy, says exactly the opposite. He says our historians look at these particular heroes and say that this is what the French Revolution is, or this is who Napoleon or whatever this era was. But rather, it is the sum of many human wills that produced the eras, and only the sum of those wills that first tolerated and then destroyed those eras. Then he makes this important claim. To study the laws of history must completely change the subject of our observation, must leave aside kings, ministers, in general, and study the common small elements by which the masses are moved. Right? So they have basically completely opposite perspectives. So Tolstoy's primary claim that it is the common person that is responsible for history, and that is where we need to look at history. Carlyle would definitely not sympathize with it, right? He would say, no, you're wrong. You're entirely wrong. Carlyle definitely doesn't believe there are no laws to history. He basically gives a lot of history right here. And now finally, when we look at A, yes, he would challenge Tolstoy on the idea that you can study history on an infinitely small scale. Now, one, history itself on an infinitely small scale is kind of unclear. But finally, this implicit belief, that's Tolstoy's implicit belief. What is an implicit belief? What is something that's implicit? Implicit is when we don't directly state a thing. But doesn't Tolstoy say this literally as directly as you ever possibly can say right here? That's not Tolstoy's implicit belief. That's his very explicit belief. So what would Carlyle most likely do? He would argue that these everyday forces and circumstances that Tolstoy is interested in require a great man to activate their potential. That is this metaphor of the lightning right here. Okay, so that is why D is correct and A, B, and C are incorrect. Okay, so question 8 here is a main purpose question. Okay, so it's basically asking us to make sense of why is the passage written the way it is and what is it suggesting, okay? Um, so clearly, if you're watching this video, you've read this passage because you took this test. I'd recommend you take a moment now to pause and reread this. It's one of the best passages you'll probably ever read in your life. It's a perfectly written thing. Um, Once you've reread it, I'm just going to go through and show why all the other answer choices are incorrect and why the correct answer choice is correct. So if you missed this one, I have a feeling you might have selected one, which is something I like to call Finding Nemo distractor. This is basically like you're going too sophisticated, too broad, too universal based off of what you've got here. It sounds really like epic, this answer choice, right? To reflect on the inevitability and consequences of the passage of time, right? But does he reflect in any explicit way on the inevitability and consequences of the passage of time? No, not really. You can maybe infer some implicit things for that in an AP Lit class, right? But that's not what we're doing here. We're on the SAT. And the SAT, you have to go direct from the text by the text in a really clean way. Okay, so yeah, you could maybe say, oh, the damp and rot would infest the pine and slowly it would consume the last vestiges of their substances. And they'd become a meaningless part of the stubborn earth to which they had long ago given themselves. Yeah, uh, I could see an argument in an AP Lit class that that could potentially be the consequences of the passage of time. But when you compare that to the correct answer, which is to portray the joyless lives of his parents and their futile struggle in the land that they cultivated, that's exactly what happens here, right? He says they had little joy. He says, uh, you know, their cheerless labor, their lives had been expended in cheerless labor, their wills broken, their intelligences numbed, right? And now they would be to the land that they cultivated, right? The earth to which they had given their lives. There's nothing wrong with C, while A basically goes too vague, too far in kind of a unsupported way. C is supportable. A hard to support in a very explicit by the text way. Okay. B, he doesn't have an attachment to his family's legacy here necessarily, right? That's not what the goal of this is to depict his emotional attachment. Rather, it's just to portray what's going on. And then finally, in D, this notion of desperation. Despair, that might have worked, right? But desperation is usually to really want something, to like doggedly pursue something. So that's why we can get rid of D. So with that, that's how we arrive to C, in part by getting rid of A, B, and D, while reading one of the better paragraphs I've ever seen written in one of the best books I've ever read. All right, so question 9 is asking us about the main idea of a text. Okay, so I'll take it that you've read this text because if you're watching this video, you've taken the test. And if you've taken the test and missed this question, you had to have read this paragraph here. So I'm just going to go through what makes every answer choice incorrect and what makes the correct answer choice correct. Okay, so the main idea of the text is going to have to focus on the claim of the text, right? Not just things that happen in the text. Okay, so for example, answer choice B. Is it true that he mentions the financial burden of preferring Diet Coke to generic soda? Yeah, sure. But is this the main idea? The main idea is him trying to suggest to audiences all over the country that, give up your Diet Coke or real Coca-Cola habit and switch to a generic soda. No, that's not his main point. That's not what he's trying to convey. That is a facet that leads to what he's trying to convey, right? So that's why we can get rid of B. Um, Now, A, everything up to a point is right? So he describes his personal preference for a specific brand. Perfect. It explains how it improves his daily experiences. Okay, now here is where it goes wrong, right? Is the main idea here to show, basically to rationalize why he prefers Coke to everything else? No, right? It's him saying, it's irrational that I do this. Why don't I try a generic soda? right? Um, and then the final wrong answer choice D, uh, here, so he doesn't necessarily say he regrets his habit of drinking soda, so we could say that is wrong. But even if you did accept that, he's not talking, the main idea of this isn't about frugality, right? It isn't to say there are many ways we could save money in our lives and we just have to embrace saving money. No, he's talking about the main idea is about decisions, right? It's about what do we choose to do and why do we choose to do it. So he's really talking about why is it that I don't try a generic soda? Why is it that I try a Diet Coke, only drink Diet Coke? And why are we all kind of like that? Why does this reveal a deeper decision-making bias, right? That is held by most people, as you see underlined there. So C captures that point perfectly, right? It goes from the personal, right, his own reluctance to try generic soda, to the broader everybody thing, right? A broader tendency of failing to experiment with alternatives that can lead to, as we see in both places here, long-term costs or cumulative costs. So that's how we arrive to C and get rid of all the other answer choices. All right, question 10 is a fun little text about parrots living in El Cajon. Um, you've probably seen them depending on where you live around San Diego. It's a main idea question, okay? So we have to consider the text as a whole. I think too often students struggle with main idea questions because they're stuck on the details. They want to just find an answer choice which says some fact from the passage, but doesn't consider what the goal of the passage really was. All right. So our correct answer here is D, which is there's specific reasons as to why D is correct, why it actually encapsulates the whole main idea. Okay. But these other answer choices which are wrong, they're not necessarily not factual. Okay. They just don't clarify the main idea. So let's talk about them. So A, several species of endangered parrots have found refuge in El Cajon, where they have been allowed to flourish outside of their home region. That's all true. And in fact, that accounts for much of the passage. However, through here, that would be correct for A. But what about all this, right? Is this attested to in A? No, right? It is a very, very important aspect of this passage, which asks, what does this mean for biologists, right? What does this mean to have a non-native species living in this area? Is it a bad thing or a good thing? Okay. So A is really close. It's really compelling, but it doesn't best state the main idea of the text, especially when we compare it to the correct answer, D, which says everything that A says, right? Suitable as habitat has coincidentally created a sanctuary for endangered species of parrots, but it also includes the rest of the passage, which has caused some local biologists to reconsider certain notions of best practice in the field. This is certainly better than A. Even if there's nothing wrong with A necessarily, A doesn't go far enough to state the main idea of this text, which is it's creating a conundrum. All right. C, uh, we don't see a disavowal of limiting the introduction of non-native species in general in this region. That's a too extreme distractor for sure. And then B, there's a bit of a mischaracterization here. It says efforts by local residents to protect endangered parrots, right? But we see that this happens by happenstance here, right? So this is a coincidental thing. So B is wrong because it wasn't on purpose. So with that, that's how we arrive to D by getting rid of A, B, and C. A is a really good distractor, but when you really buckle down and evaluate what the main idea of this text is, D is clearly better than A. Right, looking at 11 here, this is definitely a bruiser of a question. This is definitely about as hard of a command of evidence question that we're going to see on the test. Okay, so I'm taking it, if you're watching this video, you missed this question on the test. That means you've already done this question. You've read this text here. You've tried to answer the question. So I don't think I need to reread the text to you. I'm just going to focus on what's specifically being asked and how we specifically find the correct answer choice from there. Okay, so we are asked what two factors led to the particular characteristics of the future Finch songs modeled by his team. Okay, so first off, what are the particular characteristics of the future Finch songs? Right? It is that they're going to be slower and that their bandwidth of frequencies will be narrower, right? So the songs will be slower, they will come out at a slower tempo, and the number of frequencies or like the number of notes that they sing will be narrower, right? So they'll be slower and simpler. So those are the characteristics, right? The factors that lead to those characteristics are different from those characteristics, okay? The slowness and the simpleness of the songs are the consequences. We need to make sure we identify both of the causes. So, according to the text, what are the causes? All right. One, we have drought. Okay. Drought is a really big deal. He says that drought is going to be driving the development of future finches, right? Drive these ghosts of future finches that he's creating, right? These songs that don't yet exist. Uh, so, uh, this drought will then impact the other factor that is necessary for these slower, simpler songs, which is thicker beaks. All right. So our correct answers need to, our correct answer needs to demonstrate that thick beaks caused by drought are what will cause the slower, simpler songs. All right. Incorrect answer choices will have correct things in them, like A. A is an incorrect answer choice, as you'll know. But is this the connection here? No, right? Um, while it is true that future modeled finches won't be able to sing the fast movements necessary for those elaborate songs, we don't know why they have thicker beaks, right? Why are these thicker beaks coming about in A? It's not made clear, right? B, we don't talk about the consequences. We just talk about the cause, right? B talks about how thicker beaks allow a bird to crush hard seeds, which confers an evolutionary advantage in arid environments. Those are the two causes. Perfect. Thicker beaks allow birds to succeed better in an arid, drought-like condition. But what's the consequence of that? Well, we don't know, right? According to answer choice B. C puts it all together, though, right? C, we get the thicker beaks and the drought conditions. Those are both of the causes. And then we get the consequences. The slower bird songs with a narrower frequency bandwidth. Perfect. All right. D, finally, um, this part doesn't have anything to do with what the songs actually sound like. Provide empirical confirmation for ecological speciation and its plausibility. Yeah, that comes directly from the text, but it has nothing to do with the question. All right, so that's a recycled language distractor with D. So that's how we arrived to C here. It's a really good question, really good text, really interesting. This is like very typical of what the SAT will do, but on the harder side for sure. So if you're missing this, just make sure you're examining and identifying for yourself early on, what do I need to find in the correct answer and what can't be in the correct answer. All right, so question 12 is a pretty straightforward command of evidence quantitative question. So we're going to be connecting the table up here, which I'll zoom in on real quick for us. Okay, there's our table, to the text below in some way, shape, or form. So basically, we're comparing two different groups. You all know this already, but one group who got $1,000 monthly, another group which didn't. All right. And seeing how well they would be able to cover an emergency expense after that influx of cash. So looking at the study, we see a surprising thing. All right, so something surprises the researchers, and whatever surprises them needs to be correct according to the graph. So let's go through these. A, participants in the treatment group maintained a higher ability to cover the emergency throughout the study. Well, that's not true because why? When we look up here, the treatment group started out with a lower, no, marginally lower, but a slightly lower ability to cover the expense, right? The treatment group starts at 10.18, whereas the control group starts at 10.48, as we can see here, okay? So they did not maintain it over the entire time, okay? By the 18-month mark, they showed no difference in ability to cover an expense. That's not true, right? We look at 18 months. There's a significant difference there, so that's not correct. And then finally, C, the ability of participants in the treatment group cover ability to cover an emergency expense sharply increased, right? That is true, but then this part is incorrect, surpassing the ability of the control group by the 18-month mark. They surpassed the other group very early on, 6 months in. So our correct answer by way of omission, by way of elimination is D, but let's explain why. So the control group, they had a sharp decline at the beginning. Now that is kind of surprising. Why would not getting money mean you suddenly can't handle it? Um, but that's true. We do see that, right? They go from over 10% are able to handle it to only 5%, whereas the opposite is true of the other group, which is what the rest says, right? While the treatment group showed a sharp increase. Perfect. So pretty straightforward here. That's how we would get to D for this graphing question 12. All right, so question 13 is a very difficult, bruising command of evidence question, but it's one where we just need to make sure we're sticking to the parameters and we're making sure we understand what the question is asking. So the question asks, which of the following findings would be necessary to extrapolate the findings as broadly as claimed by the research team? So how does the research team extrapolate these claims, right? What does it mean to extrapolate something? That means to expand them out to a broader circumstance, right? So what are the findings? The findings are that there is some sort of link between plasticizers, DEHP and DINP, and neural processing. And the link is that those plasticizers, at least in goldfish, impair neural processing. All right, so they only did the research with goldfish. They only did it once with environmentally relevant concentrations of these things, right? And they then saw a 20% reduction in all the, some neural processing as demonstrated by the Mouthner neuron. Okay. So they proved it with goldfish. Okay. But they're extrapolating it to say that there is a causal link, right? Meaning, what is a causal link? That doesn't say casual up there, that says causal. Causal link meaning thing A causes thing B, right? Causation. They say that there's a causal link between these plasticizers and impaired brain function in vertebrates. We're vertebrates, right? So are goldfish, but we are not goldfish, okay? So just to answer this question blindly, right, by your own logic, without any answer choices, what you would need to say is, well, to extrapolate the findings about the goldfish to all vertebrates, they should probably study more than just goldfish, right? They should probably do some studies in perhaps more anatomically similar vertebrates to extrapolate it to that degree. They also would need to demonstrate a particular causal link, right? How do we know that goldfish over the course of a month, maybe just by being observed, would have some sort of impairment in their Mouthner neuron? We don't know those things specifically according to or by the facts were presented in this case. Okay. The research here doesn't demonstrate that causality or that extrapolation well enough. Okay. So to extrapolate them all the way, we need more evidence to show that it goes all the way to vertebrates. So what answer choice does that for us? Well, D does. Other vertebrates exposed to these plasticizers at similar concentrations exhibit a comparable reduction in nerve conduction speed, which is the biggest thing, right? Nerve conduction speed was the issue with those goldfish. Okay, so D accomplishes everything that we would set out to look for if we were just being asked this ourselves in a casual biology class or, some sort of class that asks us to understand basic, simple, elementary logic, right? So D answers this question simply, okay? But I also want to make sense of why these other answer choices are wrong, okay? Uh, A, well, that definitely supports their claim. That supports their finding. But does it support the extrapolation that they made? No, we're still just talking about goldfish. Okay? Yeah, DEHP and DINP are bad for goldfish. Do we know they're bad for other vertebrates? We still don't know based off of the fact that the Mothner neuron is bad in exposed goldfish compared to non-exposed goldfish. Okay? B, again, it does the same thing that A does, where it supports, right, that it's bad for goldfish, but we can't extrapolate from that. Now, C is a really good baggage distractor, right? We're seeing like, oh, concentrations of these chemicals increase by trophic level. You might be thinking to your bio classes, oh, I know that mercury increases by trophic level. Little fish get mercury, and then bigger fish eat the little fish, and then big fish eat the bigger fish, and then we eat the biggest fish and are exposed to mercury or something like that, right? But what is not established in answer choice C? That other vertebrates exposed to these plasticizers have uh, have their neural capacity impaired, right? Without that being proven, we cannot extrapolate this any further than goldfish are impacted by these plasticizers. All right. So ultimately, to extrapolate these findings, we have to do what is done in D, which is what we would have got if we just read the passage and thought about this question to ourselves in a very logical, straightforward way. All right. So if you're missing a question like this is a difficult one, right? There's a lot to consider, but if you spend your time considering it, there's nothing tricky about it, really. It's just what are they asking, and which is, how do we extrapolate this? And then answering what they're asking. So always make sure you know what they are asking rather than just what you think they might be asking. I'm assuming a lot of students miss this question because they just are thinking, which of the following best supports their claim? Which they all do in a sense. So, all right, that's how we get the correct answer here. All right, question 14 is a really cool question. It's a bit tricky, definitely. We're talking about the Chumash and their tummels, which are these really like impressive boats that they build. They've built for a long time. And we're trying to discuss one thing in particular. Okay, so biggest thing, if you miss this question, it is likely you just didn't read the question correctly, I would assume. Okay, we are trying to repudiate the established claim about trade. Okay, so one, if you don't know what repudiate means, you're kind of wrecked, right? So repudiate is a very, very commonly used word all the time. If you don't know what that means, you need to be studying your vocab because that's something that we use all the time and the SAT loves to use. Okay, so to repudiate something means to go against it, right? To refute it, to undermine it, to negative it. Okay. So needs to go against the established claim regarding trade. Okay, what is the established claim regarding trade? Well, we see established claim right here that the trade networks of pre-Columbian Pacific Coast indigenous groups were solely land-based. All right. So to undermine that claim that the trade networks were solely land-based, what would we need? We would need a claim that shows that they're not solely land-based, that shows unequivocally that trade was conducted over the ocean, right? Maritime trade took place, okay, between different indigenous groups, right? We need to see a trade network that uses the ocean. So let's go through our answer choices here and see what's wrong and see what's right. Okay, so A. Uh, A is referring to a totally different claim, a claim that you might have seen on the History Channel or, you know, some TikTok video you saw about how, like, the Polynesians came here first. They mentioned this claim right here a little bit, right? But we're not trying to repudiate the established claim about Polynesian seafaring canoes. We're trying to repudiate the claim about trade, which has nothing to do with this. All right, so A does something, but it doesn't answer our question. Okay, B, simply put, do any of these examples demonstrate anything about there needing to be maritime trade? No. What is the simple response to this? Well, they could have walked. There definitely were trade networks, according to B, but is there any proof that they're maritime? No. There's turquoise from central Mexico, which they could have walked there. Shells from the Pacific coast, which could have walked. Leather goods from the Great Plains, which could have arrived via land. All of these things could have taken place via land. There's no evidence to show that maritime trade took place or had to have taken place for B. Okay. C is our correct answer. So why? Okay. So we see a non-Chumash site. Okay. So this is a different indigenous group. And at that site, there's a Chumash tumble. Okay. So one of the Chumash boats is at a non-Chumash site. And in this Chumash boat at a non-Chumash site, there are goods from around the area, from far-flung areas, which can only have arrived via boat. And they did arrive via boat. Okay? So C is correct because it says there was trade, and that trade took place with the tummel, meaning it took place over boats, because we're at a non-Chumash site, and the Chumash boat has non-Chumash goods in it, and some Chumash goods coming from islands. So C proves it perfectly. Finally, D, uh, while D shows that there was some, evidence of trade, we don't see whether this is like a trade network that requires maritime. Yeah, a boat had to be used, but how do we know, according to D, that these goods came from Chumash controlled areas to non-Chumash controlled areas by boat? Couldn't the Chumash have brought the otters to themselves and then walked it down the coast, right? So even if D were true, C is better, right? C has a more direct correlation to demonstrate the strength of the argument that there were maritime trade, or there was maritime trade, excuse me, which is what would clearly repudiate the notion that their trade networks were solely land-based. If we're using a boat to trade things from far away, no way could you say that it's solely land-based. So that's how we arrived to C. All right, question 15 is an inference question. We always want to make sure we understand the logic of this passage in order to presume what comes next. Whatever comes next will be directly logically tied to what came before it. All right, so what does this passage say? Basically, it says that no one was few people are left-handed naturally, fewer than right-handed. And back in the 1600s or the 1500s, excuse me, on this English warship, the Mary Rose, uh, no one was allowed to be left-handed because they thought you were devil spawn or a witch if you were left-handed. Um, so as a result, people did everything with their right hands, whether they weren't or not. And as a result, we see that there is differences in bone composition between right and left clavicles. So, what could have influenced the difference in bone composition between the right and left clavicles on this English warship, where they're doing these really intense physical tasks, according to this text, every day, and probably only using their right hands because using your left hand is either not natural or devilish. Okay, it means that doing things with your right hand wears down your right clavicle or it changes its composition as opposed to the left clavicle. Okay, so that's the natural logical extension of the claim made in the passage. All right. Which choice most logically completes the task? Okay, that completes it logically. A, if left hand said right hand, A would be correct, right? You couldn't get rid of A. Both A and B would both they would both be rational. But A says encourage the use of left-handed tasks, and that's certainly not happening. I don't think we'd be encouraged to use our left hand if it's associated with the devil and witchcraft, and you could be burned for being a witch back then, right? Uh, C doesn't seem like there's anything unique about them, right? There's not certain environmental conditions. This is something that isn't even referenced in the passage whatsoever. And then finally, D is just kind of a Finding Nemo distractor. Like I don't really know how widespread belief in supernatural causes for biological differences uh, answers this question here. It's just sort of a fancy way of saying they didn't like left-handedness, but really, it isn't that everyone was left-handed, but they wouldn't do it because of the devil. It's that most people were right-handed anyways, right? So that's how we arrived to B for this question. All right, question 16 is a great question here. It's a really well thought out, logical extension. Now, I will admit one caveat here. I think that this question goes a little further than the SAT would normally go in terms of presupposing how much biology you know. Okay. The correct answer is the only answer which can be correct. But if you don't know really anything about biology, you might be worried about selecting something like answer choice D. And the SAT is always going to make sure that their answer choices don't require outside knowledge. I don't think you quite need outside knowledge to answer this question correctly, but it helps. So if you missed this because you've never taken a bio class, you probably should have taken one by now, and you might want to check in with your counselor and make sure you're going to graduate. But I wouldn't worry about this question though, right? I'd worry about some other things. Okay, so logically completing the text, we need to understand where this text is all going, right? So it's talking about the infinite monkey theorem, which is this notion that a monkey sitting at a typewriter typing forever, eternity, would somehow produce the complete works of Shakespeare because probability over an infinite time frame allows for basically all outcomes. However, researchers from Sydney recently said, okay, this is kind of tenuous because writing even a single Shakespearean play completely by chance would require the lifetime of the entire universe. Okay. But then the passage switches. Then the passage says, now, while it's interesting to realize, yeah, a monkey, even with the whole universe existence, probably wouldn't be able to type Shakespeare randomly. Uh, Saying that this has something to do with theories of biological processes like evolution is completely arbitrary, right? Because evolution doesn't happen where every single instance, every single thing in the process is by complete chance, right? Once one thing takes place, it increases the likelihood of other things taking place, right? So, random chance isn't pure in biological processes. It involves cumulative steps, right? So that's what answer choice D says. So why does that refute? Why does that go with the logic here? Well, by it's the only one which refutes the notion that the infinite monkey theorem is a good corollary for biological processes, right? The rest of these say that it is a good corollary for biological processes, basically, right? B, for example, doesn't work with this word, however, right? However means that what the claim that comes after however is going to refute the claim made in the sentence before. But be doesn't refute the claim made in the sentence before. It affirms the claim made in the sentence before, which is why we can get rid of be, right? Logically, be doesn't work even if you agree with be for some reason. Okay? Uh, so A, uh, same thing, right? A would affirm the claim that the infinite monkey theorem is a good corollary for biological processes like evolution. But we need a sentence which rejects the claim that the infinite monkey theorem is a good corollary for biological processes, right? A affirms, but we need it to reject because of the word however. Finally, C seems to just have a flawed understanding of the passage, right? Random chance alone is sufficient to account for complex outcomes given enough time and repetition. That is what the infinite monkey theorem posits, but does that have any relevance to the fact that it would never happen within the lifespan of the universe? No. Okay. Nor does it have relevance to the claim here, which is that it doesn't make sense to talk about the infinite monkey theorem when we're talking about evolutionary processes or biology or anything like that. So by process of elimination, we can get rid of A, B, and C because logically they don't adhere to the fact of this empty space has to have a particular relationship with the claims that precede it. So A, B, and C are wrong on for that reason. And then D is correct because it doesn't make any mistakes. And it has the right relationship between the claim and uh, what needs to come after that claim logically. All right. However, if you miss this because biology, you just don't know enough about biology, one, you should probably focus a little bit on the fact that really logically, D has to be correct, even if you don't know enough about biology. But you can also find some comfort in the fact that the SAT probably won't ask something that makes you consider a particular academic subject quite as much as this question does. So with that, we will move on to the writing section of Module 2. Okay, so question 17 here is our first writing question on Module 2, this test 305. Here we have what we would call a forms, function, sense, or something like that question. Basically, we're being asked about uh, verb tense and just making sure that this sentence is logical, right? Um, so first I want to talk about why we get rid of be. Uh, Everything that comes before a colon that's working as an elaboration, any colon is going to be an elaboration, needs to be an independent clause. And when we read, researchers have called this, does that sound as though it's finished uh, by the word this? No, it's a fragment. So because it's not a complete sentence, we cannot go with be because that colon. Same thing for C, right? Resulting in what researchers call, it sounds like we're missing something there, right? And that sounds like that because this is just a fragment. We don't have a complete independent clause. So B and C are both wrong because this colon cannot work because it needs to come after an independent clause. All right. Now, why is A wrong? Because A sounds pretty good. A, we have a comma splice up here. All right. We cannot connect two independent clauses with just a comma. We need to have a comma with a fanboys or a semicolon or a period, right? Researchers have called this a promising development in efforts to address food security is clearly an independent clause. So now D is correct because it isn't an independent clause when it's written as such, right? Resulting in what researchers call a promising blah, 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 blah is a dependent clause because resulting is a subordinating conjunction. As opposed to our coordinating conjunctions, which are fanboys, subordinating conjunctions are a whole bunch of different options, and resulting is perfect here because we can use a comma to connect an independent clause. This is an independent clause from early to photosynthesis to a dependent clause, which is resulting to security. So using this comma to connect a dependent clause to a preceding independent clause is perfect. And the rest of these are wrong because they create some sort of error either with the colon or with a comma splice or what have you. All right, so question 18 here on module 2 is certainly a very tricky question because we have a lot of different punctuation accomplishing many different tasks. All right, so we have a non-essential phrase, which we're demonstrating with the dashes. I'm just going to explain why B is correct ultimately. We have a non-essential phrase, which is demonstrated by the dashes, right? So the layer of the atmosphere just below the stratosphere, where most aircraft cruise, is a non-essential phrase, right? Um, so, of course, every single one of these answer choices properly demonstrates the correct, like, um, non-essential phrase. So that's all good. Now, what is missing in some of these? Well, D is missing the comma before in the upper troposphere, which is necessary, and somewhere in between in the upper troposphere, that's a separate element, so we need a comma there, which D is lacking, okay? But A, B, and C all possess that necessary comma. All right, now there is a missing comma in A as well, because without the comma between stratosphere and where most aircraft cruise, it suggests that there is more than one stratosphere, right? Just below the stratosphere where most aircraft cruise suggests that there's a stratosphere where aircraft don't cruise, right? But that doesn't make sense logically, okay? Which is another reason as for why meaning is our first goal when examining and moving through these uh, punctuation questions. All right. Um, Now, finally, C possesses a comma that we don't need, right? The layer of atmosphere just below the stratosphere, right? That suggests that the layer of the atmosphere just below the stratosphere, where most aircraft cruise, sort of confusing there, unnecessary commas, which is how we arrive to B. All right, question 19 about the uncanny valley. It's an interesting little passage here, but we're really just focused on why are we using the plural present tense form of to be as are instead of any other tense? Okay, so are means we have to have more than one thing, which we do. We have morality salience and pathogen avoidance. These are the two possible triggers of this phenomenon. All right. So, as such, we have uh, a good, clear, double, more than one plural thing, which is why we have to be plural here. Okay, that's why we cannot go with is. Now, if you selected is, I'd assume because you read, okay, among the various precepts is morality salience. And you see that here we're defining morality salience for a long time, and you think, okay, I don't need to read the rest of this. This is all useless information. All I need is morality salience. I see that we have our one thing that's the possible trigger of the uncanny valley, and therefore we're going to use the present tense singular is. However, that's why you have to read the whole thing. If you don't, you're going to select is, but if you do, you're going to see clearly that the answer is are. Okay, the reason why we're not at was is because was, on the one hand, is singular, which we don't want, but also it's in the past tense, while psychologists offer is present tense. And then finally, has been would suggest with this auxiliary verb here that it has stopped being, or that they offered this in the past, but they don't offer it any longer. We would need some sort of time referent, and we don't have one. So that's why we don't need the auxiliary verb. So for this one, if you missed it, it's likely that you just didn't continue reading the whole passage, which is a mistake that you'll make if you are trying to move too quickly or you're running low on time, which is a bummer, but if you lock in here, you'll see clearly, yes, we have two things, morality salience and pathogen avoidance. All right, so 20, we have a classic SAT trick getting us to conjugate a verb with a non-essential phrase between where the verb is conjugated and where the subject of that verb is. All right. So this is going to be difficult for students if instead of focusing on uh, the correct verb and subject agreement, which is between amphibian and here, you look at something wrong. Either you're looking at, species or a group or both land and water or whatever. Okay. So the definition is the real subject here. So the definition blank. Okay. The definition of an amphibian is the subject. The definition. All right. So when we go from that subject, the definition includes, we don't have that option, right? The definition include, does that make sense? No. The definition including more species doesn't make sense, right? Once we've connected those two, it should be pretty clear. Okay, the definition can include. That's the only way in which we have the conjugation allowing for the right number, meaning singular, etc. Okay? Had included would mean that it one time had just those, but now has less or more or whatever, right? But there is no time referent, there is no change in the definition. It's just saying amphibians can include, things that also live in arid environments, right? Um, so make sure we connect our actual subject to our actual verb, something that the SAT does all the time. Don't get stuck looking at what's in the non-essential phrase. All right, question 21 does something that we also saw on question 20 and on question 19. Kind of combines those two questions in a sense, in that we have a verb conjugation that is separated from its subject uh, by a long non-essential phrase, and that non-essential phrase can make it unclear what it actually is. All right, so if you're a student who chose was because you saw this was here, notice this dash and this dash mean everything from here to here is a non-essential phrase. We cannot consider it in terms of what subject is agreeing with this verb, right? So, was, even though they say the band was seen in a certain way at one point, or was known as a certain thing at one point, is irrelevant to the fact that Duster, this band which uh, very few people really, really, there was a small number of people who really, really, really loved Duster, and then suddenly they became huge on TikTok, and now everyone has heard Duster. You watching this video probably have heard Duster. Um, we see that actually this is in the present tense, right? Is one of the most widely listened to artists of the 2020s. All right. That means, seeing as that we're in the 2020s, is fits here. We'll have to edit this question by the time we get to 2030, but that's quite a ways off. So, as such, we know, so R is the correct number. The band are one of the most, okay, one clarifies that we have to be singular, right? So we can't use are and we can't use were because those are both plural. And then whether we're in the present or the past tense, well, 2020 means we're in that present tense, 2020s. So that's how we get there. We don't want to get tripped up on all of the information in the non-essential phrase. All right, so 22 is our final punctuation grammar style question of the test here, 305. Here, we are trying to determine two things. One, is flock singular or is it plural? And then two, is flock possessive or not? Okay, so ultimately, the biggest thing we need to know, uh, a passenger pigeon flocks. So a passenger, we have this singular here. means that our answer choice, flock, has to be singular. The only option which is singular is A. Okay, all the rest of these are not singular. All right. Remember, when we put the apostrophe after an S, it means that we are saying that that subject is plural and possessive. So it's singular and possessive, right? Which is why we need to go with A. Okay, so the a passenger pigeon flock's unique ability or unique capacity to seem as though an individual organism, okay, we have multiple references which clarify that this is singular, which is why we have to go for A for 22. All right, so for 23, we have a transitions question. Uh, Basically, we need to understand the logic of this passage first, or the logic of the units that are relevant, which is this sentence here and this sentence here. So what is the relationship between these two sentences? And that will reveal to us what transition we want to use. So uh, basically, all through here, we have the example of popes, kings, queens. They choose a regnal name. I presume that's how it's pronounced because of regal. Uh, that they get after becoming the ruler, and they become known for that name rather than their birth name, right? And then as a result, is what we're looking to say, they're remembered for those names as opposed to their birth names, right? Pope Francis, his birth name is Jorge, right? But we all know him as Pope Francis. Okay. So if you missed this one, I have a feeling you might have chosen henceforth, or evidently not really knowing exactly what those mean. Okay. So henceforth has the word hence in it. So you might think, it means therefore. But henceforth means from this point on. Okay. From this point, current, from this current moment on. Okay. Doesn't make sense here. We're looking for something that says as a consequence. Evidently, you might think, oh, evidence, right? As evidence, blah, 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 right? But evidently is actually uh, a sometimes presented as a caveat, right? Or some slight of a contrast. It isn't a cause and effect transition type. Okay. So consequently is our only cause and effect type transition, which is what we're looking for based on the logic of this, which is why we go with it. Similarly, of course, doesn't really work because this isn't similar to what came before. So that's how we arrived at D. All right, question 24 here is our final transitions question of test 305. So we are being asked basically to figure out a transition here. If you're missing this question, I have a feeling you might be falling into one small trap, which is this notion that transitions questions or transitions need to be sort of sophisticated sounding when really they don't. Okay, so that is, you might be afraid of when we have something that sounds a little fancier, like furthermore or thus. But what does that is mean? Okay, so that what we need here is a bit of a comparison, right? We're basically giving an example of what comes before, right? So we're giving an additional information that exemplifies or emphasizes what we said before, which is we're emphasizing the fact that young people believe that their slang is new when in fact they may have been around for forever. Okay, which we see with cooked being here. I was actually watching a movie from 1939 recently, or 1940, and they say crash out over and over again. What does it mean when a man crashes out? Or what could cause a man to crash out? Over and over again. Swear to God. Okay, so cooked, coming from the 1930s as well. Okay, so that is the exemplify type transition here, and it's the only one that is. Why do we know it's the only one that is? Well, thus is a cause and effect, right? That would mean that this is a consequence of what comes before, but it's not. Yet is a pivot, right? Uh, we are not pivoting from what came before. Finally, furthermore means to add an additional claim to another claim, right? It's to add information that supports a particular claim rather than exemplifying or restating what that claim is, right? So if this gave another example, right? Furthermore, they believe X, Y, and Z. If the first sentence said, young people believe A, B, C, furthermore, they believe X, Y, Z, we could use that. However, we're just restating the same claim that comes from the previous sentence, which is why that is works better than any of these other answer choices. Don't get hung up on what sounds good. Remember, we're always looking for specific meaning, and how we get there is by understanding the meaning of the passage. That's how we arrived at D. It's a transitions writing question officially, but it's really also a reading question deep down. All right, so this question 25 here is a long rhetorical synthesis question, which was intentional on our part, but don't worry, the actual test doesn't have questions that are quite this long. Um, but they are here because um, I think, or here they're very long, which is intentional because I think it helps us practice moving through them quickly enough, right? I've heard from students that the second module of the SAT is really long, so this is an attempt at that. Right? We want to make sure that we are documenting the role of cassette tapes over time, right? And we want to make sure that we don't fall into the trap of using an incorrect or false or non-existent point from the notes to answer this, okay? So let's go through what's wrong with all of these and what's right with the right one. Uh, so cassette tapes, yes, their role has changed, but they continue to be relevant with high quality sound and widespread use in commercial production. Okay, this isn't correct, right? This relevant part is good. It does say that they're still relevant, but for high quality sound and widespread use in commercial production, not true. Okay. Sound engineering. So B says that their role has enabled DIY music production. Okay, that's all true, but their poor quality sound caused them to fade from use and they remain a niche interest. Okay, this is the part that's not correct, right? It isn't that cassette tapes were worse sounding or better sounding according to everything else. It was the advent of convenient CDs and MP3s. Okay, so poor sound quality is a claim that isn't attested to in the notes. All right, now let's look at C, which is correct. We have a lot of good things, right? It was a dominant format in these eras. It doesn't say the dominant format, but just a prominent one. It fostered the rise of DIY music production and mixtapes. Okay, so it was important, right? Right here, right here. Uh, and then finally, continues to serve as a low-cost medium valued by independent music communities, right? Right here we have that note. So everything in C is correct, and it does show the role changing over time. Well, finally, D, it was originally dominant for these things. They are now relevant as a nostalgic collectible. So the dominant medium is kind of a problem. And then also professional and personal recording as well as personal listening. We didn't really see it in the professional setting quite as much, but either way, this thing, the dominant, and that they're just nostalgia collectibles for niche audiences, uh, seems to be a bit of an improper interpretation of these final two notes. So that's where we arrive to C, and we get rid of A, B, and D. All right, so question 26 is another of these really long rhetorical synthesis questions. Here we just want to make sure that we're getting all of the points we need and we're not going any beyond. So what do we got going on here? We are looking to make a connection between Tarahumara traditions and ultra endurance running. All right, so and we want to make sure that we're not making any false claims from the notes. So I'm just going to show what's wrong with each incorrect answer choice and what's correct with the correct answer choice. Okay, so A, what do we have wrong here? Their traditional foot race doesn't mean that there doesn't show their primary reliance on running for transportation, and it hasn't influenced the training techniques of ultramarathon runners. So this is good, right? And they do rely on running to some degree, though they also rely on animals and other things. However, this is the biggest issue wrong here. Okay. Um, B, uh, the connection between Copper Canyon being known because of this book as too tenuous, right? Now, it does say that this book did introduce or bring some widespread attention to Copper Canyon, but it's not like it didn't exist before. Um, so we have B being too far out, which is why we can get rid of B. All right. So C, everything in here is correct, right? So they have minimalist footwear, which we see uh, right here. They have the minimalist footwear, good, right? Cultural emphasis on endurance, which we see right here, good. And their running-based lifestyle, which we have here as well. These two, good, right? All made them an inspiration in the modern ultramarathon community, which we see here and here. Okay, so this covers everything perfectly. There's nothing missing, and it doesn't say anything that's false. All right. Finally, D, it says so, but this character, Lorena, who you may have seen in a Netflix movie or something like that, is why the Tarahumara are well known. But that is too specific. It doesn't tell the whole story. So that's why we can get to C and eliminate A, B, and D. All right, so for 27, we have our final question of the test. It's a rhetorical synthesis question. I'm just going to point out what's wrong in each incorrect answer choice and what's right in the correct one. So A is our correct answer, as you will know. Let's just talk about what's correct here. So we want to highlight similarities and differences. So we have similarities, right? Crafting stringed instruments. But then we have some differences, okay? So sustainable tone woods for Taylor, which is true. We see that here. Right? Both of these are East County, San Diego companies, El Cajon and Spring Valley. Whereas Deering is all about traditional craftsmanship, right? We see that right here, okay? And right here. Actually, I had a friend work at the Deering factory. So as a result, everything is right about A, okay? So that's why it's correct. But, if you were going through this on your own, we want to make sure that there's something wrong in all the rest of these, right? So B says only Taylor produces instruments still used by professional musicians today. Not true, right? Why do we know that's not true? Well, because we have here Deering banjos are used by people such as these ones, right? So that's why we can't go with B. What's wrong with C? This word solely. Mass production and computer-aided manufacturing, right? We don't see that saying that that's all that they do, though they may use that to some degree. It's not explicit. And then finally, Deering emphasizes sustainability through tone wood collection. That, as we know, is actually Taylor guitars. So that's why we can get rid of B, C, and D and go to A. And with that, that brings us to the end of our test 305. Thanks for watching this review video and taking the test, and hope it was a good ride for y'all. Have a good one. Bye.